Now that we've got our login form working, let's now get our registration form working as well. This is going to be fairly easy to implement after the last video, as it's mostly the same concepts. So what you see here is our register form component, and you'll see that it's set up very similarly to the login form component. So in the template we have three inputs. We've got input name, which we haven't used yet. And we've got input email and input password, which we've used before in the login form. Coming down to the component config, we have a submit method here where the name, email and password first get validated, and in the rest of the function we can fill that part out ourselves. Now since the code here is very similar to the code that we used in the login submit method, I'm actually just going to copy that code from out of here and paste that directly here. And now what we can do is just modify this so it will work for the registration process. So the main thing that we need to do is up here when we retrieve our model, we're also going to need to get the name property as well. And down here where we have the login method, we want to change that to the register method, and we also want to pass in name into the data for that method. Everything else is going to work exactly like it did in the login form component. So after we register the user, we'll then want to update the user's data in the app, and then we'll also want to delete the user model that we've just created, which will reset the form. Before we try and test the form, there's some view auth config that we're going to require though. So remember that the registration endpoint on our API is post users. However, the default registration route in view auth config is post auth register. So we're going to have to override that config, and we can do that by creating another property in our view auth config, which is register data, and we'll assign that an object with the property URL, and we can now put in the correct URL like that. We also want to add a redirect property here as well, and just like we did with the login, we want to redirect to the home page. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste that in there. Coming over to the browser now, let's test out our registration form. So I'll put in some data, including a random email address, a random password, and we'll click submit. Now we get redirected to the home page after that, so that's a pretty good sign. And if we come down into the network tab, you can see that we've got a call to users here, the users endpoint. It's a post and it's given us a 200 response. So that's a pretty good indication that everything's working. Now before we finish this video, there's an additional feature that we're going to add. So you'll recall from the last module of the course that we're persisting state in our local storage. Now the main purpose of this is to ensure that cart items are present after we reload the page. But one security issue that we have is that the email and password will also be persisted. So let's type in an email address into the login form, for example. So I'll just put in anthony@test.com. And if we now check local storage, where is it? Over here. And we look in the Vuex section here. And it's a little hard to see, but if we check our entities and go into users, you'll see that that user information has been stored, and we can see the email has been stored there in local storage because we're persisting all of our Vuex data. Needless to say, it's not good to have an email and password stored in local storage, so let's go ahead and fix that. So I've opened up the store index file now, and what we're going to do is we're going to pass some config options to the create persisted state method that we're using as a plugin down here. So I'm going to pass in an object, and I'm going to give this a property filter, and we'll assign a function to this property. Now this function gets passed in any mutations that are run against the store, and you can return true or false depending on not whether you want to persist that mutation to local storage or not. So obviously by default, all mutations are going to be persisted, but we can now override that. So the argument for this method will be an object containing the commit data. Now, what I'd like to do is just deconstruct that and get the payload out of that. Not all commits are going to have a payload, so what I want to do in the function body is actually return a ternary operator, and we're going to check if the payload exists. And if it does, we want to ensure that any mutations on the user entity are not persisted. So let's go payload.entity does not equal users. Now for any other mutation, we can just return true. Coming back to the browser now, if I go to the login form again, put in something random for the email, and we come down here to our local storage, and we'll check what's stored for the Vuex persisted state. I'll open that up, and if we look in users now, go into the data. There, you'll see that the email value is blank despite having filled out the form like that. So that tells us that we're no longer persisting that sensitive data.